The bullet had missed her by inches, and Fay Gardner didn't even flinch as she continued reading Whitman to her Jersey cow in the middle of the Kansas prairie. Her voice steady despite the chaos, erupting 3 miles away in Taylor, where outlaws were robbing the bank. It was July 1883, and the heat shimmered off the parched earth like liquid gold. Fay sat on an overturned bucket beside her favorite cow, Buttercup, with a worn book of poems balanced on her knee. Her calico dress was faded from too many washings, and her dark blonde hair hung in a thick braid down her back. She was 20 years old, though most days she felt ancient from the responsibility of keeping her father's farm running after his passing 2 years prior. "Listen, my dear friend," she said to Buttercup, who chewed her cud with placid contentment. "This part is beautiful. I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you." The cow's large brown eyes regarded her with what Fay liked to imagine was understanding. She had been reading to the animals since she was a girl, finding in them a more patient audience than most humans ever provided. The chickens didn't criticize her for being too bookish. The pigs didn't tell her she should focus on finding a husband instead of losing herself in verse. The horses never laughed at her for believing words could matter in a world that seemed to value only survival. Fay turned the page carefully, mindful of the book's fragile spine. It had belonged to her mother, one of the few things she had left from the woman who died bringing her into this world. Her father had read these same poems to her throughout her childhood, instilling in her a love of language that felt as necessary as breathing. "You know what I love about Whitman?" she asked Buttercup conversationally. "He sees divinity in everything, in grass, in animals, in ordinary people doing ordinary things. He would have liked you very much." A hot wind kicked up dust devils in the distance. The farm was modest, just 40 acres her father had claimed and worked until his heart gave out. Now it was hers, along with the mortgage payments, the endless repairs, and the loneliness that sometimes threatened to swallow her whole. She had her animals, though, and her books, and the wide Kansas sky that turned the most extraordinary shades of purple and orange at sunset. She was about to begin another poem when she heard the thunder of hoofbeats approaching. Fay looked up, shading her eyes against the brutal sun. A rider was coming fast from the direction of Taylor, his horse lathered with sweat. As he drew closer, she could make out a tall figure in the saddle, broad-shouldered and moving with the easy confidence of someone who had spent most of his life on horseback. Fay stood slowly, her hand moving instinctively to the old rifle that leaned against the barn wall several feet away. A woman alone had to be cautious, especially when strangers came riding in like the devil himself was chasing them. The rider pulled his horse to a stop about 20 yards from where she stood. He raised both hands to show he meant no harm, and Fay got her first good look at him. He was young, maybe 25, with dark hair that curled at his collar and several days' worth of stubble shadowing his jaw. His eyes were an unusual shade of gray-green, like storm clouds over spring grass. Despite the dust coating his clothes, she could see he wore the practical gear of a working cowboy. Worn leather chaps, a faded blue shirt, and a hat that had seen better days. "Madam," he said, his voice a deep rumble that somehow carried clearly despite not being raised. "I apologize for startling you. My horse threw a shoe about a mile back, and I was hoping you might have a spare or at least some tools I could borrow." Fay studied him carefully. His horse was indeed favoring its left front hoof, and the man himself didn't have the desperate, wild look of an outlaw. Still, caution was wise. "There are tools in the barn," she said, keeping her distance. "I can watch your horse if you want to fix the shoe yourself." Something like amusement flickered across his face. "Fair enough. Name's Garrett Cooper, and I promise I'm not here to cause any trouble, just passing through on my way to Wyoming." "Long way from Wyoming," Faye observed. "Yes, madam, it is." He dismounted with fluid grace and led his horse forward slowly, giving her plenty of time to object. When she didn't, he stopped near the barn entrance. "Been working cattle drives down in Texas. Saved up enough to buy into a ranch up north with my brother." Faye pointed to where the tools hung on the barn wall. As Garrett set to work on his horse's hoof, she found herself watching him with more curiosity than was probably appropriate. His hands were competent and gentle with the animal, and he worked with the quiet efficiency of someone who had performed this task 1,000 times before. She was about to return to her reading when his voice stopped her. "Was that Whitman you were reading?" Faye turned, startled. "You know Whitman, Leaves of Grass, if I'm not mistaken." He didn't look up from his work, but she could hear the smile in his voice. "My mother was a school teacher back in Missouri. She made sure all her children could read and appreciate poetry, much to my father's bewilderment." Something warm and unexpected bloomed in Faye's chest. In 3 years of living in Taylor, she had never met another person who could quote poetry, let alone appreciated it enough to recognize passages from across a barnyard. "I read to the animals," she admitted, feeling suddenly self-conscious. "Most people think I'm touched in the head for it. Most people don't understand that reading aloud isn't really about whether the listener comprehends the words." Garrett straightened, testing the new shoe on his horse's hoof with satisfaction. "It's about the sound of language, the rhythm of it. Animals respond to that just like humans do. Maybe better, since they're not judging the content." Faye found herself walking closer, drawn by this unexpected kinship. "Exactly. My father used to say that poetry was music made from words, and all living things respond to music." "Your father sounds like he was a wise man." "He was." Faye's throat tightened slightly. "He died 2 years ago, heart failure." "I'm sorry." The sympathy in Garrett's voice sounded genuine. "That must make running this place alone quite a challenge." "I manage." She lifted her chin, defensive pride flaring. She had heard too many men suggest she should sell the farm, that a woman alone couldn't possibly succeed at agriculture. "The animals and I get along just fine." Garrett's horse nudged him insistently, apparently ready to continue their journey. He stroked the animal's nose absently but made no move to mount up. Instead, he looked at Faye with an expression that was hard to read. "Would you think me terribly forward if I asked what you were reading? The specific poem, I mean." "Song of Myself," Faye said, unable to suppress a small smile. "Though I suppose that's fairly obvious given the quote. It's a long piece. Were you reading the whole thing to your cow?" "I read whatever strikes my fancy on any given day. Buttercup here seems to prefer Whitman, but the chickens are partial to Emily Dickinson, and my old horse likes Shakespeare's sonnets." This time Garrett's laugh was full and genuine, transforming his dusty, trail-weary face into something almost handsome. "You've matched your animals to specific poets. That's wonderful. You must think I'm strange. I think you're the most interesting person I've met in about 500 miles of traveling." He said it simply, as if it were an obvious fact rather than a compliment. "Would you mind terribly if I stayed to hear the rest of the poem? It's been a long time since I heard good poetry read aloud, and longer still since I had a conversation about literature with anyone." Faye knew she should be cautious. Knew she should send this stranger on his way and return to her solitary existence. But the loneliness that had become her constant companion whispered seductively about how nice it would be to share her passion with someone who actually understood it. "I suppose it would be all right," she said slowly. "For one poem." Garrett's smile was like sunrise breaking over the prairie. He tied his horse to the fence rail where it could reach the water trough, then settled himself on the ground near where Faye had been sitting, maintaining a respectful distance. She reclaimed her bucket, very aware of his presence in a way that made her skin feel too tight. She cleared her throat and began to raid, her voice finding its rhythm as she moved through Whitman's sprawling, ambitious verses. Garrett listened with an intensity that was almost palpable, his gray-green eyes focused on her face in a way that made her cheeks warm. When she finished the section she had marked, he was quiet for a long moment. "You read beautifully," he said finally. "Like you understand not just the words but the spirit behind them." "I've always felt that Whitman was trying to capture something essential about being alive," Faye said, surprised to find herself articulating thoughts she had never shared with anyone. "The way everything connects, how there's no real separation between ourselves and nature, between the individual and the whole." "He was a mystic hiding in a poet's clothing," Garrett agreed. "My mother used to say he saw God in everything, which is why the religious folks of his time found him so scandalous." They fell into conversation then, the kind of deep, ranging discussion about literature and philosophy that Faye had dreamed of but never experienced. Garrett had read widely despite his profession, carrying books in his saddlebags and reading by campfire light during the long cattle drives. He quoted Keats and Byron, knew Emerson and Thoreau, and had even read some of the newer poets whose work was just beginning to circulate. The sun tracked across the sky as they talked, and Faye found herself laughing more than she had in months. Garrett had a dry sense of humor and a gift for storytelling that brought his cattle drive adventures to life. He described the vast herds moving across the Texas plains, the night sky so full of stars it seemed impossible, the camaraderie and hardship of life on the trail. In turn, Faye told him about her childhood, about learning to farm alongside her father, about the books that had sustained her through lonely seasons. She described her mother's poetry collection, carefully preserved despite hardship, and how reading those books made her feel connected to the woman she had never known. "You have other family?" Garrett asked as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen. "My father had a brother in St. Louis, but we lost contact years ago. It's just me now." Faye tried to keep her voice matter-of-fact. "What about you? You mentioned a brother in Wyoming. 2 brothers, actually. Graham is the eldest, then me, then Gregory. Graham bought the ranch 6 months ago and has been building it up. Gregory and I have been working to earn our share of the partnership. Gregory's already up there. I was just finishing a last drive to contribute my portion of the capital. You must be looking forward to seeing them." Something complicated crossed Garrett's face. "I am, though I confess I'm less enthusiastic about ranching than they are. I love working with animals, don't misunderstand, but I always thought I might do something different with my life." "Like what?" "This will sound foolish coming from a cowboy covered in trail dust, but I used to think about being a teacher, like my mother." He said it quietly, as if admitting something shameful. "But that's not practical for a man trying to make his way in the world. The ranch is a solid opportunity, and I'd be a fool not to take it." Faye heard the resignation in his voice and understood it intimately. How many times had she pushed aside her own dreams of perhaps teaching poetry or even writing it herself, knowing that survival had to come first? "I don't think it sounds foolish at all," she said firmly. "The world needs teachers as much as it needs ranchers, maybe more." Garrett looked at her with such gratitude that her heart squeezed. "Thank you for saying that." A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the sound of buttercups continued chewing and the distant call of a meadowlark. Faye realized with a start that the sun was getting low on the horizon. "You should probably be on your way if you want to make Taylor before full dark," she said reluctantly. "The town's only about 3 miles east." Garrett looked toward the setting sun, then back at her, and Faye could see him wrestling with something. "I know this is presumptuous," he said carefully, "but would it be possible for me to camp nearby tonight? I could sleep in your barn or even just out in the field. It's just that it's been a long time since I had such good conversation, and I find myself reluctant to see it end quite yet." Every sensible instinct told Faye to say no. A woman alone couldn't invite a strange man to stay on her property, no matter how kind he seemed or how much she enjoyed talking to him. The neighbors would gossip, and her reputation was already precarious enough as the odd farm girl who read poetry to livestock. But another part of her, the lonely part that ached from too many silent evenings, desperately wanted to say yes. "I have a spare room in the house," she heard herself say. "It's small, but there's a proper bed. You could stay there if you promise to be on your way first thing in the morning." "I promise," Garrett said, and the relief in his voice told her he had been just as reluctant to leave as she was to see him go. "And I insist on earning my keep. I can handle any repairs you need, tend to your animals, chop firewood, whatever would be helpful." "I won't turn down help," Faye admitted. "The south fence has been needing attention for weeks, and I haven't had time to get to it." They worked together through the remaining daylight, Garrett proving as capable with fence posts as he was with horseshoes. Faye found herself stealing glances at him as they worked, noticing the way his muscles moved beneath his shirt, the competent efficiency of his movements. More than his physical presence, though, she was drawn to the easy companionship between them, the way conversation flowed naturally even as they focused on their tasks. As dusk painted the sky in shades of lavender and gold, Faye led him to the small farmhouse her father had built. It was modest but well-maintained, with whitewashed walls and cheerful curtains her mother had sewn years ago. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, dominated by a stone fireplace and a sturdy wooden table. 2 small bedrooms opened off the main space, along with a simple washroom. "It's not fancy, but it's home," Faye said, suddenly self-conscious about her humble circumstances. "It's lovely," Garrett said, and he sounded like he meant it. "It has character, warmth. You can tell this was a house filled with love." Faye showed him to the spare room where her father had slept, now kept neat and ready despite having no occupant. She provided fresh water for washing and clean linens, then retreated to the kitchen to prepare supper. She had only simple fare to offer, but she made it as nice as she could. Fried ham, cornbread, green beans from her garden, and apple preserves she had put up the previous fall. Garrett ate with the enthusiasm of someone who had been living on trail food for months, complimenting every dish until Faye laughed and told him to stop flattering her. After dinner, they sat on the front porch as the stars emerged overhead. The summer night was warm and clear, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled its lonesome song. "Will you read something else?" Garrett asked quietly. "I know you probably think I'm being silly, but I meant what I said earlier. It's been so long since I heard poetry, and you have such a gift for it." Faye had brought her mother's book outside, almost as if she had anticipated the request. She opened it to a marked page, choosing something different from the Whitman they had shared earlier. "This is Elizabeth Barrett Browning," she said. "Have you read her work?" "Some, though I confess I'm less familiar with her than I should be." Faye began to read, her voice soft in the darkness. The poem was one of Barrett Browning's sonnets, speaking of love and devotion in language that was both elegant and deeply felt. As the words left her lips, Faye became intensely aware of Garrett's attention, of the intimacy created by poetry and darkness, and the honest loneliness they both carried. When she finished, neither of them spoke for a long moment. The air between them felt charged with something Faye didn't quite know how to name, something that made her pulse quicken and her breath catch. "That was extraordinary," Garrett finally said, his voice rough. "You were extraordinary." "It's just reading," Faye said, though she knew it was more than that, knew that something profound was happening between them even if she couldn't fully articulate what. "It's not just reading. It's sharing something precious, something that matters to you. You trusted me with that, and I don't take it lightly." Faye turned to look at him in the starlight, seeing the honesty in his face, the genuine appreciation, and something else that made her heart race. She should send him to bed, should retreat to her own room and put proper distance between them. Instead, she heard herself asking, "Would you like to hear another?" "I would like," Garrett said slowly, "to hear you read every poem ever written if you'd be willing to share them with me." They stayed on the porch until the moon rose high and bright, Faye reading poem after poem while Garrett listened with unwavering attention. She shared Dickinson's precise observations, Shakespeare's passionate sonnets, Poe's dark musings, and Blake's mystical visions. Between poems, they talked, sharing observations and interpretations, discovering again and again how similarly they saw the world. It was well past midnight when Faye finally closed the book, her voice growing hoarse from so much reading. "I should let you get some rest," Garrett said, though he made no move to rise from where he sat. "You've been more than generous with your time and hospitality." "I've enjoyed it," Faye admitted. "More than I can properly express. It's been lonely here since my father died. I didn't realize how much I missed having someone to talk to, really talk to, about things that matter." "I know exactly what you mean." Garrett stood reluctantly, offering her his hand to help her up. When their fingers touched, Faye felt a jolt of awareness that traveled up her arm and straight to her core. Garrett must have felt it too because he held her hand a moment longer than necessary, his thumb brushing gently across her knuckles. "Thank you, Faye," he said softly. "This has been one of the best evenings I can remember." "You're welcome, Garrett." They stood there in the moonlight, hands still joined, and Faye thought he might kiss her. Part of her desperately wanted him to, while another part was terrified by how much she wanted it. But Garrett was a gentleman, and he simply squeezed her hand once more before releasing it and bidding her good night. Faye lay awake in her bed for a long time after, listening to the old house settle and thinking about the unexpected turn her day had taken. She told herself firmly that Garrett would be gone in the morning, that this was just a pleasant interlude in her otherwise solitary existence. But her heart, traitorous thing that it was, had already begun to hope for something more. She woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon, and for a disoriented moment thought her father must be making breakfast as he used to do. Then memory returned, and she dressed quickly, braiding her hair with fingers that trembled slightly with nervousness. Garrett stood at her stove, remarkably at ease despite the domestic setting. He had clearly washed and shaved, and in the morning light streaming through the windows, Faye was struck again by how handsome he was. "I hope you don't mind," he said, looking slightly sheepish. "I'm accustomed to rising early and I thought I might make myself useful." "I don't mind at all," Faye said, touched by the gesture. "Though you're a guest, you shouldn't be cooking." "A guest who promised to earn his keep," Garrett reminded her. "Besides, I wanted to do something nice for you after you shared so much with me yesterday." They ate breakfast together as the farm came to life around them, chickens clucking in their coop and Buttercup lowing to be milked. The easy companionship of the previous evening continued, though now there was also a new awareness between them, a tension that was not quite uncomfortable but definitely present. "I should get on the road," Garrett said after they finished eating, though his tone lacked conviction. I've imposed on you long enough, and my brothers are expecting me in Wyoming." "Of course," Faye said, ignoring the way her stomach dropped at his words. "You have responsibilities, a future waiting for you." Garrett stood and began gathering his few possessions, moving with obvious reluctance. Faye walked with him to the barn where his horse waited, trying to think of something to say that would adequately express what his visit had meant to her without sounding desperate or foolish. He saddled his horse in silence, his movements methodical but slow. When everything was ready, he stood with the reins in his hand, looking at Faye with an expression that was almost anguished. "I don't want to go," he said abruptly. "I know that's ridiculous. I know we only just met yesterday, and I have obligations, and you have your farm, and this doesn't make any logical sense, but I don't want to leave you." Faye's heart was beating so hard she was certain he must be able to hear it. "I don't want you to go either," she whispered. "Would you think me insane if I asked to stay another day, just one more day? I could help with your farm work, and maybe tonight you could read to me again. I know I'm being selfish, but I can't seem to help myself." "Yes," Faye said before she could think better of it. "Stay, please stay." The relief on Garrett's face was profound. He tied his horse back up and turned to her with a smile that made her knees weak. One day became 2, then 3, then a week. Garrett worked tirelessly around the farm, fixing everything that had fallen into disrepair during Faye's solitary tenure. He repaired the barn roof, reinforced the chicken coop against predators, cleared the irrigation ditches, and helped her bring in the hay harvest that she had been dreading trying to manage alone. But more precious than the physical labor was the companionship. They talked constantly, discovering shared views and complementary differences that made their conversations endlessly fascinating. Garrett told her about his childhood in Missouri, about his parents who had worked themselves to exhaustion trying to build a better life for their sons, about the restless wandering that had defined his 20s as he tried to figure out where he belonged in the world. Faye shared her own history, the loneliness of growing up as an only child in the middle of the vast Kansas prairie, the way books had been her escape and salvation, the grief that still occasionally overwhelmed her when she thought about her father. She told him about the struggle to keep the farm going, the mortgage payments that kept her up at night, the subtle and not so subtle pressure from townspeople who thought she should give up and find a husband to take care of her. "You're doing a remarkable job," Garrett said firmly when she expressed her fears about failing. "This farm is well maintained, your animals are healthy, your fields are productive. Anyone who suggests you can't manage alone is blind or prejudiced or both." "The bank manager suggested last month that I should consider selling and moving to town," Faye admitted. "He said it wasn't proper for a young woman to be living alone out here." "What you do with your property is none of his business," Garrett said, anger flashing in his storm-colored eyes. "You have every right to live your life as you see fit." His fierce defense of her autonomy made Faye feel seen and valued in a way she never had before. The men in Taylor either dismissed her as an oddity or viewed her as a problem to be solved. Garrett treated her as an equal, respecting her intelligence and capability while also being genuinely interested in her thoughts and feelings. Every evening, they continued their ritual of poetry reading on the front porch. Faye worked her way through her entire collection, then started reading her father's old newspapers and journals when she ran out of poetry. Garrett listened to everything with the same intense attention, often asking questions that led to lengthy discussions about meaning and interpretation. One evening, about 10 days after his arrival, Garrett asked, "Do you ever write poetry yourself?" Faye felt her cheeks heat. "Sometimes, not that it's any good. May I hear some?" "It's really not worth sharing." "Faye," Garrett said gently, "you've shared so much of yourself with me already." I would be honored to hear your own words, not just those of published poets." Reluctantly, Faye retrieved a small journal from her bedroom where she kept her private attempts at verse. Her hands shook slightly as she opened it, feeling more vulnerable than she had even during their most personal conversations. She read hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence as she saw the genuine appreciation on Garrett's face. Her poems were simple observations of prairie life, meditations on solitude and nature, explorations of loss and longing. They were rough and unpolished but honest. When she finished, Garrett was quiet for a long moment. "Those are beautiful, Faye. Truly beautiful. You have real talent." "You're just being kind." "I'm being honest. Your imagery is striking, your emotional honesty is powerful, and you have an excellent sense of rhythm. With practice and study, you could be a published poet." Faye laughed, though the idea sent a thrill through her. "I don't think the world is ready for poetry from a Kansas farm girl." "The world needs poetry from Kansas farm girls," Garrett said seriously. "It needs authentic voices speaking truth about real experiences. You shouldn't hide your gift." No one had ever spoken to Faye that way before, as if her dreams might actually be possible rather than foolish fantasies to be set aside in favor of practicality. She looked at Garrett in the gathering darkness and felt something shift in her chest, some final wall crumbling away. "Why are you still here?" she asked softly. "Your brothers must be wondering what happened to you." Garrett met her eyes steadily. "I think you know why. Tell me anyway." He moved closer, near enough that she could feel the warmth of his body in the cooling evening air. "Because I'm falling in love with you, Faye Gardner. Because every day I spend with you makes me more certain that I don't want to spend my life anywhere you aren't. Because when you read poetry, I see the person I've been searching for without even knowing I was searching." Faye's breath caught in her throat. "We barely know each other. It's only been 10 days. And yet I know you better than people I've spent years around. I know that you're brave and kind and fiercely independent. I know that you see beauty in ordinary things and find meaning in words and care for every living creature in your charge. I know that your laugh makes me feel like I could accomplish anything, and your smile is the best thing I see all day." "Garrett," Faye whispered, her eyes suddenly hot with tears, "I'm falling in love with you too. I think I started falling that first afternoon when you recognized Whitman and didn't think I was strange for reading to my cow. You're the least strange person I've ever met. You're perfect." Then he was kissing her, and Faye discovered that all the poetry she had ever read hadn't prepared her for the reality of being kissed by someone she loved. His lips were gentle but insistent, and she kissed him back with all the loneliness and longing she had carried for so long, finally finding an outlet in this connection with another person. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Garrett rested his forehead against hers. "I need to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to think carefully before answering because it's going to change everything. All right, come with me to Wyoming. Not because I'm trying to take you away from your farm or your independence, but because I can't imagine my life without you in it. We could build something together, you and I. My brothers would love you, and there's plenty of room on the ranch for you to keep animals and grow things. You could write your poetry and I could work with cattle, and every evening I would ask you to read to me like you've been doing." Faye pulled back slightly, her mind racing. "You're asking me to leave my home, my father's farm, everything I know." "I'm asking you to take a risk on us," Garrett said. "I know it's terrifying and I know you have roots here, but Faye, what kind of future do you have in Taylor? You said yourself that you're barely making the mortgage payments, that the town doesn't understand you, that you're lonely. Come with me. Marry me. Let's build a life together." "Marry you." Faye's voice came out as a squeak. Garrett had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. I suppose I'm doing this backward. I don't have a ring and this isn't very romantic, but yes, I'm asking you to marry me. I love you, Faye. I want to spend the rest of my life listening to you read poetry and watching you talk to animals and discovering all the wonderful things about you I haven't learned yet. Faye's practical side screamed at her to be cautious, to point out all the reasons this was a terrible idea. They had known each other less than 2 weeks. She would be entirely dependent on him in a strange place. If the marriage failed, she would have nothing but her heart. The part of her that had come alive over these past days whispered something different. It reminded her that she had never felt as understood, as valued, as cherished as she did with Garrett. It pointed out that keeping the farm meant a lifetime of grinding work and loneliness, while taking this risk meant adventure and partnership and love. "I'm scared," she admitted. "So am I," Garrett said. "But I'm more scared of losing you, of spending the rest of my life wondering what might have been if I had been brave enough to ask." Faye thought about her father, who had left everything familiar in Ohio to claim a homestead in Kansas, who had always encouraged her to be courageous in pursuing what mattered to her. She thought about her mother's poetry books, about how love was a central theme in so much of what she read, the thing that gave meaning to existence. "Yes," she heard herself say. "Yes, I'll marry you and come to Wyoming." Garrett's whoop of joy startled the chickens in their coop. He picked Faye up and spun her around, both of them laughing with the slightly hysterical glee of people who have just made a life-altering decision. When he set her down, he kissed her again, and this time Faye let herself fully feel the joy and desire and love that flooded through her. This was real. This was happening. She was going to marry this wonderful, poetry-loving cowboy and start a completely new life. The practical details, however, were daunting. Faye would need to sell the farm and livestock, pack her belongings, and prepare for a journey of several hundred miles. They would need to get married legally, though finding a minister in Taylor who would perform the ceremony quickly might be challenging. "We'll figure it out," Garrett assured her when she started listing obstacles. "We'll take it one step at a time. First thing tomorrow, we'll go into Taylor and start making arrangements." That night, Faye barely slept, her mind spinning with excitement and terror. She got up several times to look at the small room that had been her whole world, trying to imagine leaving it behind. Each time, she reminded herself that she wasn't really leaving anything behind so much as moving toward something better. In the morning, they rode together to Taylor, Faye on her old mare and Garrett on his gelding. The town was small, just a main street with a general store, a saloon, a church, a bank, and a handful of other businesses. Most of the 300 residents were farmers or ranchers, with a few merchants and craftsmen mixed in. Their first stop was the church, where Reverend Thomas listened to their request with raised eyebrows. "You want to be married when?" he asked, clearly skeptical. "As soon as possible," Garrett said. "We're heading to Wyoming and would like to be wed before we leave." "Young man, I don't perform hasty marriages for couples I don't know. How long have you been courting Miss Gardner?" 2 weeks, Faye admitted, seeing the Reverend's disapproval deepen. "But we're quite certain of our feelings." 2 weeks is hardly enough time to know if you're compatible for a lifetime together, Reverend Thomas said sternly. "I would strongly encourage a longer engagement, at least 6 months. "We don't have 6 months, Garrett said. "My brothers are expecting me in Wyoming, and Faye and I don't want to be separated." The Reverend folded his hands and regarded them with the expression of someone dealing with foolish children. "If your feelings are genuine, they'll survive a period of separation while you court properly. Miss Gardner, I've known you since you were a child. Your father would want you to be sensible about this." Faye felt her temper, usually well-controlled, beginning to rise. "My father would want me to be happy, and I am happy with Garrett." We're both adults, Reverend, perfectly capable of making our own decisions. Making rash decisions at 20 years old is precisely the kind of mistake I'm trying to prevent you from making, the Reverend said. I'm sorry, but I cannot in good conscience marry you under these circumstances. They left the church frustrated but not defeated. There must be another option, Garrett said. What about the justice of the peace? Taylor didn't have a dedicated justice of the peace, but the bank manager, Mr. Hensley, was authorized to perform civil marriages. Faye's heart sank at the prospect of asking the same man who had suggested she sell her farm, but they had few alternatives. Mr. Hensley proved only slightly more accommodating than the Reverend. He agreed to perform the marriage but insisted on a 3-day waiting period, claiming it was to ensure they had time to reconsider. And there's the matter of the marriage license, he said, shuffling papers on his desk. That will be $5. $5 was a significant sum, but Garrett paid it without hesitation. They filled out the necessary paperwork, and Mr. Hensley scheduled the ceremony for 3 days hence. As they left the bank, Faye felt the weight of curious stares from townspeople who had clearly noticed the strange cowboy accompanying her. She knew the gossip would be flying fast and furious through Taylor by nightfall. Their next stop was the land office, where Faye reluctantly inquired about selling her farm. The clerk, a thin man named Patterson, looked up the records and hummed thoughtfully. 40 acres with a house and outbuildings mortgaged to the bank, he recited. You still owe about $300 on the note. Best I could do is find you a buyer at maybe $500, which would leave you $200 after the mortgage is settled. It was less than Faye had hoped, but more than she had feared. How long would it take to arrange a sale? Week or 2, maybe. There's a family from back east looking for a starter farm. They might be interested. Faye agreed to list the property, feeling a pang of grief despite her excitement about her future with Garrett. This land represented her father's dreams, her own history. Selling it felt like a betrayal, even though she knew it was necessary. They spent the rest of the day in Taylor, purchasing supplies for the journey to Wyoming and making arrangements for Faye's livestock. The general store owner, Mrs. Chen, was one of the few people who seemed genuinely happy for Faye. It's about time you had something good happen, the older woman said, wrapping Faye's purchases in brown paper. You've been alone too long, working yourself to the bone. This young man looks like he'll take good care of you. I will, madam, Garrett promised. I'll spend the rest of my life making sure she's happy. Mrs. Chen beamed at him. See that you do. And Miss Gardner, you make sure to write and let us know how you're getting on in Wyoming. Some of us will miss you. The kindness brought tears to Faye's eyes. She had sometimes felt invisible in Taylor, but apparently some people had been paying attention after all. They rode back to the farm as the sun was setting, both quieter than they had been that morning. The reality of the enormous changes they were undertaking was settling in, making everything feel suddenly very real and immediate. Are you having second thoughts? Garrett asked as they unsaddled the horses. No, Faye said truthfully. Just first thoughts, I suppose. Really thinking through what this means. Are you? Not for a second, Garrett said firmly. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me, Faye. I mean that. That evening they sat on the porch as usual, but instead of reading, they talked about the future. Garrett described his brothers. Graham, who was serious and responsible, and Gregory, who was charming and occasionally reckless. He told her about the ranch they had purchased in Wyoming's Wind River Valley, about the mountains that rose like cathedral spires, about the crystalline streams and endless grasslands. It sounds beautiful, Faye said wistfully, and frightening. I've never been more than 20 miles from where I was born. We'll discover it together, Garrett said. And Faye, I promise you, there will be space for you to write your poetry and read to animals and be yourself. I'm not trying to turn you into someone different. I love who you are right now. What if your brothers don't like me? They'll love you. How could they not? But Faye's anxiety persisted. She was entering Garrett's world, meeting his family, joining an established household. What if she didn't fit in? What if she disappointed them? Garrett seemed to sense her spiraling thoughts. "Come here," he said gently, pulling her close against his side. "Feel that? My heart beating. It only beats like this when I'm near you. You make me feel alive in a way I never have before. Whatever challenges we face, we'll face them together." That's what marriage means. Faye rested her head on his shoulder, letting his solid presence calm her fears. "Read to me," she asked. Garrett laughed softly. "I'm not nearly as good at it as you are. I don't care, I want to hear your voice." So Garrett picked up the Whitman and began to read, his deeper voice giving the poems a different quality than Faye's readings. She closed her eyes and listened, thinking that this quiet companionship and shared appreciation for beautiful language was worth any risk. The 3 days before the wedding passed in a blur of activity. The potential buyers came to view the farm and agreed to purchase it for the price Patterson had suggested. Faye packed her belongings, surprised by how little she had accumulated in 20 years of life. A few clothes, her mother's poetry books, her father's pocket watch, some kitchen items, and her own journal of poems. Everything else she was leaving behind or selling with the farm. Garrett helped her sort through everything, never pressuring her but offering opinions when asked. He proved to have a gift for organization, systematically working through each room and deciding what needed to be kept, sold, or discarded. "You're very good at this," Faye observed as they worked through the kitchen. "I've moved around enough in my life to know how to pack efficiently," Garrett said. "Though I confess I'm looking forward to settling in one place with you. I'm tired of wandering." On the eve of their wedding, Faye's neighbor, Mrs. Sullivan, rode over to check on her. The older woman had been kind to Faye since her father's death, occasionally bringing over food or helping with heavy work. "I heard in town that you're getting married and leaving," Mrs. Sullivan said without preamble. "Is this really what you want, Faye? You're so young, and you barely know this man." Faye invited her in for tea and introduced her properly to Garrett. Mrs. Sullivan subjected him to a thorough interrogation that would have been comical if it weren't so sincere. She asked about his family, his prospects, his intentions toward Faye, his views on women's independence, and about a dozen other topics. Garrett answered everything patiently and honestly, and by the end of the visit, even skeptical Mrs. Sullivan seemed convinced. "He seems like a good man," she admitted as she prepared to leave. "But Faye, promise me that if you're ever unhappy or need help, you'll write to me. A woman should always have someone she can turn to." "I promise," Faye said, touched by the concern. "And thank you, Mrs. Sullivan, for everything you've done for me since Father died." "Your father was a good man, and you're a good girl," Mrs. Sullivan said, her eyes suspiciously bright. "You deserve to be happy. I hope this young man gives you the life you deserve." After she left, Faye found herself crying for the first time since Garrett had arrived. Not sad tears exactly, but an overwhelming release of emotion that had been building for days. Garrett held her while she cried, not trying to fix anything, just offering comfort. When she finally calmed down, he wiped her tears gently. "Tomorrow we start our life together," he said softly. "Are you ready?" "I'm ready," Faye said, and realized she meant it. They were married the next day in Mr. Hensley's office, with Mrs. Chen and Patterson serving as witnesses. Faye wore her best dress, a simple blue cotton that had been her mother's, and Garrett had clearly made an effort to clean up, his hair neatly combed and his clothes freshly pressed. The ceremony was brief and unromantic, just a legal recitation of vows and the signing of documents. But when Garrett slipped a simple gold band onto Faye's finger and said, "I promise to love you, cherish you, and listen to you read poetry for the rest of my life," she felt the words settle into her heart like an oath more binding than any legal document. "And I promise to love you, support you, and share all the words I know with you for as long as we both live," Faye replied. Mr. Hensley declared them married with obvious relief, clearly glad to have this irregular situation resolved. Mrs. Chen hugged them both and pressed a package of food into their hands for the journey. They spent their wedding night at the farm, in Faye's childhood bed, and Faye discovered that the poets had been writing about something real when they spoke of physical love. Garrett was patient and gentle, and if there was awkwardness born of inexperience on both their parts, there was also tenderness and genuine care. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the darkness, Garrett said, "I want you to know that I see this marriage as a partnership. Your dreams matter as much as mine. Promise me you'll keep writing your poetry, that you won't let the demands of ranch life silence your voice." "I promise," Faye whispered. "And you promise me you won't give up on your dream of teaching. Maybe there's a way to do both." "Maybe there is," Garrett agreed. "With you, anything seems possible." They left for Wyoming 2 days later, having settled all of Faye's affairs in Taylor. The $200 from the farm sale was safely tucked away, along with the small amount Faye had saved over the past 2 years. It wasn't a fortune, but it was something, a safety net that gave her a measure of security. The journey to Wyoming took 3 weeks of hard traveling. They followed established trails north and west, camping under the stars most nights and occasionally stopping at small towns to resupply. Faye had never traveled so far from home, and despite the hardship of the journey, she found herself exhilarated by the constantly changing landscape. They crossed into Nebraska, then followed the North Platte River into Wyoming territory. The land grew more dramatic, with buttes and mesas rising from the plains, and in the distance, the Rocky Mountains created a jagged purple line against the horizon. Every evening, no matter how tired they were, Garrett asked Faye to read to him. She worked her way through her collection again, finding new meanings in familiar poems as her circumstances changed. Whitman's celebration of the open road took on fresh significance. Dickinson's explorations of home and belonging resonated differently. Even Shakespeare's love sonnets felt more immediate, more real, now that she was living her own love story. They also talked endlessly, learning the small details of each other's lives that would form the foundation of their life together. Garrett told her about his childhood, about the father who had died when he was 15, leaving him to help support the family. He described his mother's grace under pressure, how she had continued teaching even while taking in laundry and mending to make ends meet. Faye shared memories of her father, the way he had sung while working in the fields, his patience when teaching her to read, his quiet grief for the wife he had loved and lost. She told Garrett about the first time she had read a poem that truly moved her, about discovering that words could create emotions as powerful as any real experience. "What was the poem?" Garrett asked. "It was Keats. A thing of beauty is a joy forever." "I was 9 years old, and suddenly I understood that beauty wasn't just about pretty things, but about moments and ideas and truths that endure. It changed everything for me." "That's remarkable," Garrett said. "Most people never have that kind of epiphany, never really understand the power of art." "What about you? When did you first fall in love with poetry?" Garrett thought for a moment. "I was about 12, and my mother was reading The Charge of the Light Brigade aloud. The rhythm of it, The way it captured both the glory and the tragedy of that battle, it just gripped me. I made her read it 3 times in a row, and then I memorized it. I used to recite it while doing chores, much to my brother's annoyance. Can you still recite it? So Garrett recited Tennyson's famous poem There Under the Stars, his voice giving the cavalry charge a living presence, and Faye fell in love with him all over again. As they traveled, they also began to learn the practical rhythms of partnership. Garrett proved surprisingly capable at cooking over a campfire, while Faye was better at finding good campsites and spotting potential hazards. They divided labor naturally, each gravitating toward tasks that suited their skills and preferences. They also navigated their first disagreements, minor conflicts about routes and timing and how to pack the horses that taught them how to communicate and compromise. Faye discovered that Garrett could be stubborn, but was always willing to listen to reason. Garrett learned that Faye's quiet demeanor hid a will of iron when she felt strongly about something. "I like that you push back when you disagree with me," Garrett said after one such discussion. Some women would just go along with whatever their husband said, even if they thought it was wrong. "I'm not some women," Faye said, "and you married me knowing that." "I did, and I'm grateful for it every day." They were about 5 days from their destination when they encountered trouble. They had stopped to water the horses at a creek when 3 men rode up, rough-looking characters with hard eyes and predatory smiles. "Well, well," one of them said, a barrel-chested man with a scar across his cheek. "What do we have here?" A cowboy and his pretty little wife, all alone in the middle of nowhere. Garrett stepped slightly in front of Faye, his hand moving toward the gun at his hip. "We don't want any trouble. We're just passing through." "Maybe we want trouble," another man said, leering at Faye in a way that made her skin crawl. "Maybe we're tired of riding and could use some entertainment." "I suggest you move along," Garrett said, his voice dangerously calm. "Right now, before this becomes a situation none of us want." The scarred man laughed. "Big talk from one cowboy facing 3 of us. I'm thinking we'll take your horses, your supplies, and maybe your woman too. What do you think about that?" Everything happened very fast after that. The scarred man reached for his gun, but Garrett was faster, drawing and firing in one smooth motion. The shot hit the man in the shoulder, spinning him out of his saddle. The other 2 men went for their weapons, but Faye had already grabbed the rifle from their packs. She wasn't as fast as Garrett, but she was a decent shot from years of hunting rabbits, and her bullet caught the second man in the leg. The third man, suddenly facing 2 armed and clearly capable opponents, threw up his hands. "Don't shoot. We're leaving, we're leaving." He grabbed his wounded companion and helped him onto a horse, while the scarred leader clutched his shoulder and glared at them with impotent fury. The 3 outlaws rode off, and Garrett kept his gun trained on them until they were well out of range. When they were finally alone again, Garrett turned to Faye with wide eyes. "That was incredible shooting. Where did you learn to handle a rifle like that?" "My father taught me," Faye said, her hands shaking now that the danger had passed. "He said every person living alone on the prairie needed to know how to protect themselves." Garrett pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "You were amazing. Terrifying, but amazing. Remind me never to make you really angry." Despite the fear still thrumming through her veins, Faye laughed. "I was so scared I thought I might be sick." "So was I," Garrett admitted. "But we protected each other just like we promised. We're a good team, Mrs. Cooper." "We are indeed, Mr. Cooper." They didn't linger at that creek, riding several more miles before making camp in a more defensible position. That night, Garrett held Faye close as she read, both of them finding comfort in the familiar ritual after the violence of the afternoon. "Do you think we'll always have to face dangers like that?" Faye asked when she closed the book. "I hope not," Garrett said. "But if we do, I'm glad I have a wife who can shoot as well as she can read poetry. You're full of surprises, Faye Cooper." Faye smiled against his chest. "I suppose I am. Though I'd prefer if my shooting skills remained mostly theoretical." "Agreed. Now read me something calming. I'm too worked up to sleep." So Faye read gentle poems about nature and peace until Garrett's breathing deepened and he drifted off, and she allowed herself to do the same, feeling safe despite the vast wilderness surrounding them. 5 days later, they crested a ridge and Garrett pointed to a valley spread out below them. "There," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That's the ranch. That's home." Faye looked down at the Wind River Valley and felt her breath catch. It was beautiful, more beautiful than she had imagined. The valley was wide and green, watered by a river that caught the afternoon sun like liquid silver. Mountains rose on all sides, their peaks still snow-capped even in July. The ranch itself consisted of a main house, a large barn, several outbuildings, and extensive corrals. "It's magnificent," Faye breathed. "It will be yours too," Garrett said. "Our home, our future, our life together." They rode down into the valley as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. As they approached the house, two men emerged, and Faye recognized them as Garrett's brothers from his descriptions. Graham was indeed the oldest looking, with the same dark hair as Garrett but more heavily built, and with lines of responsibility etched around his eyes. Gregory was slighter, with a quick smile and restless energy. "Garrett," Graham strode forward, pulling his brother into a rough embrace. "We were starting to worry you'd decided to skip out on us." "Never," Garrett said. "I just got delayed by something wonderful." He reached back to help Faye dismount, keeping her hand in his as he turned to his brothers. Gregory, I want you to meet my wife, Faye. Faye, these are my brothers." Both men stared at them in shock. "Your wife," Gregory said. "When did you get married?" "You didn't say anything about a woman in your last letter." "I hadn't met her when I wrote that letter," Garrett said, grinning. "It's a recent development." "How recent?" Graham asked, his tone skeptical. "Very recent," Garrett admitted, "but I promise you this wasn't a rash decision. Faye is the most remarkable woman I've ever met, and I'm the luckiest man alive that she agreed to marry me." Faye felt herself blushing under the scrutiny of Garrett's brothers. Graham looked concerned, clearly thinking his brother had made a terrible mistake. Gregory appeared more amused than anything, looking between Garrett and Faye with open curiosity. "Well," Graham said finally, "I suppose congratulations are in order. Welcome to the family, Faye. I hope you know what you've gotten yourself into, marrying a Cooper." "I'm beginning to understand," Faye said, finding her voice. "Thank you for the welcome." Gregory stepped forward and shook her hand with more warmth than his older brother had shown. "Any woman who can put that look on Garrett's face must be something special. Come on, let's get you both inside. You must be exhausted from traveling." The ranch house was spacious and well built, with a large main room, a kitchen, and several bedrooms. It was clearly a bachelor household, with a certain lack of comfort and decoration, but the bones were good. Over dinner, which Gregory cooked with surprising skill, Garrett told his brothers an edited version of how he and Faye had met and fallen in love. He described finding her reading poetry to her cow, recognizing Whitman, their long conversations, and his certainty that she was the person he was meant to spend his life with. Graham still looked skeptical, but Gregory was charmed, especially when Garrett mentioned Faye's own poetry. "You write poetry?" Gregory asked, leaning forward with interest. "I'd love to hear some sometime if you'd be willing to share." "Maybe," Faye said cautiously. "They're not very good." "Don't let her modesty fool you," Garrett said. "She's genuinely talented. Given time and opportunity, I think she could be published." That's quite a claim, Graham said, though his tone was slightly warmer than before. Garrett's always been passionate about literature, but he's not usually prone to exaggeration. I'm not exaggerating, Garrett said firmly. Faye has a real gift. But more than that, she's brilliant and brave and capable. She kept her father's farm running alone for 2 years. She can shoot better than most men I know, and she sees the world in this amazing way that makes me want to be better. Faye squeezed Garrett's hand under the table, touched by his defense of her. Well, Graham said, I suppose time will tell. For now, welcome to the ranch, Faye. I hope you'll be happy here. That night, Garrett showed Faye to the room they would share, a corner bedroom with windows overlooking the valley. It was sparse but clean, and Faye could already imagine how she might make it feel like home. What do you think? Garrett asked anxiously. I know it's not much compared to having your own farm, and I know my brothers are skeptical, but I promise you, we'll make this work. It's wonderful, Faye said honestly. Different from what I'm used to, but wonderful. Your brothers seem nice, even if Graham is cautious about me. Graham's been responsible for the family since our father died, Garrett explained. He worries about everyone and everything. He'll warm up to you once he sees how happy we are together. And Gregory likes you already, I can tell. He's always been the most open to new experiences, the most willing to take risks. They settled into bed, and despite her exhaustion from weeks of travel, Faye found herself too keyed up to sleep. Everything was new and strange, and she was acutely aware that she was now part of an established household rather than mistress of her own domain. Read to me, Garrett asked, as if sensing her unease. I've gotten spoiled by our nightly readings. I don't think I can sleep without them anymore. Faye smiled and retrieved her mother's book from her pack. In the lamplight, she read Keats and Byron, and slowly, the unfamiliar room began to feel more like home. The next few weeks were an adjustment. Faye had to learn the rhythms of ranch life, which was different in many ways from farming. There were cattle to tend, horses to train, fences to maintain across a much larger property than she had been accustomed to managing. The 3 brothers worked together with practiced efficiency, and Faye sometimes felt like she was in the way. But Garrett was endlessly patient, teaching her about cattle and horses, explaining the ranch operations, and making sure she felt included in decisions. He also protected her time, insisting that she have space to write and read, even when there was work to be done. Your poetry is important, he told Graham when his older brother suggested Faye could help with mending instead of spending an afternoon writing. She needs time to nurture her gift, just like we need time to work on the ranch. Graham frowned but didn't argue, though Faye could tell he thought it was foolish. She tried not to let it bother her, focusing instead on building her relationship with Gregory, who was much more interested in her literary pursuits. Will you read some of your poems to me? Gregory asked one evening when Garrett was out checking on a difficult calving. I'm curious to see what has my brother so convinced of your talent. Faye hesitated, then retrieved her journal. She read a few of her simpler pieces, watching Gregory's face for his reaction. To her surprise, he listened with genuine attention, and when she finished, he looked thoughtful. Those are really good, he said. You have a way of capturing small moments and making them feel significant. That line about the prairie wind carrying forgotten songs, that's beautiful. Thank you, Faye said, pleased and embarrassed in equal measure. You read much poetry, not as much as Garrett, but I've always enjoyed it. Our mother made sure of that. She used to say that a person without poetry in their life was only half alive. I like that sentiment. She would have liked you, Gregory said. She always hoped her sons would marry women who valued education and art, not just practical matters. What about Graham? Does he read poetry? Gregory laughed. Graham reads about cattle breeding and land management. He's the most practical person I've ever met, which is probably why the ranch is doing so well. But it also means he doesn't always understand why some things matter even if they're not immediately useful. He thinks I'm frivolous, doesn't he? He thinks you're an unknown quantity that has changed the dynamics of the partnership, Gregory said honestly. But he'll come around. Graham judges people by their actions, and once he sees that you're committed to building a life here, he'll accept you. Faye took that advice to heart and began looking for ways to contribute to the ranch beyond just the domestic work. She started a vegetable garden, which would help feed them through the winter. She began keeping chickens, which provided eggs and meat. She also discovered she had a gift for working with the horses, particularly the younger ones that needed gentling. "You're a natural," Garrett said, watching her coax a skittish yearling to accept a halter. "Where did you learn to handle horses like that?" "My father always said that animals respond to calmness and confidence," Faye explained. "If you approach them with patience and respect, they'll usually work with you." "You should take over the horse training," Garrett suggested. "I think you'd be better at it than any of us." So Faye began working with the horses, finding in the work a satisfaction that reminded her of her farm in Kansas. The horses didn't care about her literary pretensions or unconventional marriage. They just responded to her gentle persistence, and gradually they began to trust her. One afternoon, about 6 weeks after their arrival, Faye was working with a particularly difficult mare when Graham came to watch. She was aware of his presence but didn't let it distract her, continuing to speak softly to the horse while slowly introducing the bridle. "You're patient," Graham observed when the mare finally accepted the bit. "Most people would have given up or gotten rough with her by now." "Force just makes them more afraid," Faye said. "Patience works better in the long run." Graham was quiet for a moment. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. "I've been unfair to you since you arrived. I was worried that Garrett had made an impulsive mistake, that you would be a burden on the ranch or that you'd convince him to leave. But I can see now that you're committed to building a life here, that you're willing to work hard and contribute. I'm sorry for doubting you." Faye felt a rush of relief and gratitude. "Thank you, Graham. That means a lot to me." "Garrett loves you very much," Graham continued. "I can see it every time he looks at you, and I can see that you love him too. That's what matters in the end." "It is," Faye agreed. "Everything else we can figure out together." From that point on, the atmosphere in the house eased considerably. Graham stopped watching Faye with suspicion and began including her in ranch decisions. The four of them began to function as a real unit, each person contributing their strengths to the whole. Faye settled into a rhythm that satisfied both her practical and artistic sides. Mornings were for ranch work, tending her garden, caring for the chickens, working with the horses. Afternoons, Garrett had convinced his brothers, were for her writing. She would take her journal and find a quiet spot, usually by the river or up on a ridge overlooking the valley, and write. The landscape inspired her in ways Kansas never had. The mountains, the changing light, the wild beauty of Wyoming territory gave her new subjects to explore. Her poetry began to change, becoming more confident and ambitious. She wrote about love and partnership, about finding home in unexpected places, about the courage required to build a new life. In the evenings, she would read to Garrett, and often Gregory would join them, the three of them discussing poetry and literature late into the night. Even Graham occasionally lingered to listen, though he never commented much, just seeming to enjoy the sound of Faye's voice. As fall approached, and the mountains began to show the first hints of gold and red, Faye realized she was happier than she had ever been. The loneliness that had defined her life in Kansas was gone, replaced by the daily companionship of people who valued her for who she was. One evening in late September, after everyone else had gone to bed, Garrett asked Faye to walk with him down to the river. The night was clear and cold, the stars brilliant overhead. "You remember," Garrett said, "that first day I rode up to your farm when you were reading Whitman to Buttercup?" "Of course I remember. It changed my entire life." "Mine too." Garrett stopped walking and turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "I've been thinking a lot about that day, about how unlikely it was that I would happen to need a horseshoe replaced in exactly that place at exactly that time, about how easily we might have missed each other." "Fate," Faye said softly, "or providence or blind luck, whatever you want to call it." "I want to call it a gift," Garrett said. "A gift I'm grateful for every single day. Faye, you've made me happier than I ever thought possible. You've brought poetry and beauty and meaning into my life in ways I didn't even know were missing." "You've done the same for me," Faye said. "More than you know. Before I met you, I was so lonely. I had my books and my animals, but I didn't have connection, didn't have someone who truly understood me. You gave me that." "I want to give you more," Garrett said. "I want to give you everything. And I had an idea I wanted to discuss with you." "What kind of idea?" "There's a town about 15 miles from here called Lander. It's small but growing, and I heard recently that they're looking for a school teacher. The position pays $30 a month." Faye blinked, not immediately understanding what he was suggesting. "That's good for whoever gets the position. I think you should apply for it." "Me, Garrett, I'm not a trained teacher. Neither were most of the teachers out here. You're educated, you love literature, you're patient and good with living creatures. You'd be an excellent teacher. But what about the ranch? I'm just starting to find my place here to contribute. I can't abandon that." "You wouldn't be abandoning anything," Garrett said earnestly. "We could adjust the schedule so you could still help with the horses and your other projects. And Faye, think about it. You'd have your own income, your own independent purpose beyond the ranch. You could teach children to love poetry the way you do. You could make a real difference." "What about your dream of teaching?" Faye asked. "You're the one who wanted to be a teacher. And I still might someday. But right now the ranch needs me and I'm content with that. You, though, you're ready for this. And I think it would make you happy." Faye's mind raced. The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. She had never considered teaching as a real possibility, always thinking of it as a fantasy beyond her reach. But Garrett was right that frontier schools often hired people with far less education than she had. And the thought of sharing her love of literature with young minds was deeply appealing. "You really think I could do it?" she asked. "I think you'd be brilliant at it," Garrett said, "but more importantly, I think it would fulfill something in you. You deserve to have dreams beyond just being a rancher's wife, Faye. You deserve to be more." "I'll think about it," Faye promised. Over the next few days, she did think about it, imagining herself standing before a classroom, introducing children to the poetry that had shaped her own life. The more she considered it, the more right it felt. She discussed it with Gregory, who was enthusiastic. "You should absolutely do it," he said. "The ranch will survive without your full-time attention, and you'd be wasted if all you ever do is domestic work." Even Graham, when told of the plan, was supportive. "It's a good opportunity," he agreed. "And the extra income would help us invest more in expanding the herd. If you want to do it, you should." So Faye rode to Lander with Garrett and applied for the teaching position. The town council interviewed her, testing her reading and arithmetic, asking about her views on education and discipline. When they asked why she wanted to teach, Faye spoke from the heart about the power of literature to transform lives, to open minds and hearts to new possibilities. 2 weeks later, she received word that the position was hers. She would begin teaching in January, when the winter term started. Faye celebrated quietly that night, reading aloud to Garrett from her favorite poems, then sharing some new pieces she had written about their life in Wyoming. "These are your best work yet," Garrett said when she finished. "You should think about submitting them for publication. You're biased because you love me." "I'm honest because I love you," Garrett corrected. "There's a magazine in Denver that publishes Western writing. I think you should send them a selection of your poems. What if they reject them? Then you'll send them somewhere else. You're too talented to keep your work hidden, Faye. The world deserves to read what you write." So Faye, emboldened by her new teaching position and Garrett's faith in her, carefully copied out 10 of her best poems and mailed them to the Denver magazine. She tried not to hope too much, tried to prepare herself for rejection. Winter came to the Wind River Valley, transforming it into a landscape of white and blue. The ranch work slowed during the coldest months, giving everyone time for indoor projects and rest. Faye prepared for her teaching position, planning lessons and gathering materials. In January, she began teaching 15 students ranging from age 6 to 14. It was challenging work, trying to meet the needs of such different ages and skill levels, but it was also deeply rewarding. She introduced her students to poetry on the very first day, reading them Whitman's "I Hear America Singing," and asking them to think about how their own lives contributed to the country's great song. Some students took to literature immediately, hungry for the beauty and meaning they found in poems and stories. Others were more resistant, particularly the older boys who thought reading anything beyond the basics was pointless. But Faye was patient and persistent, and gradually, even the skeptics began to engage. She would come home each evening tired but energized, telling Garrett about her students' insights and questions. He listened with genuine interest, often offering suggestions or ideas for lessons. "You're a natural teacher," he said one night, "just like I knew you would be." In March, a letter arrived from the Denver magazine. Faye stared at it for several minutes before working up the courage to open it, certain it would be a rejection. Instead, the editor informed her that they were accepting 3 of her poems for publication in their summer issue. They would pay her $5 for the pieces. Faye read the letter 3 times to make sure she hadn't misunderstood, then let out a whoop of joy that brought all 3 Cooper brothers running. "What happened?" Graham asked, looking alarmed. "They're publishing my poems," Faye said, waving the letter. "An actual magazine is going to publish my work." Garrett picked her up and spun her around, both of them laughing with delight. Even Graham looked pleased, clapping her on the shoulder in congratulations. "This calls for a celebration," Gregory declared, and they spent that evening in high spirits, toasting Faye's success with the bottle of whiskey Graham had been saving for a special occasion. That night, lying in bed with Garrett, Faye felt a contentment so complete it was almost frightening. "Is it possible to be too happy?" she asked. "I keep waiting for something to go wrong." "Nothing is going to go wrong," Garrett said. "You're allowed to be happy, Faye. You've earned it." "We've earned it," Faye corrected. "This life we're building together, it's better than anything I could have imagined back in Kansas." "You ever miss it? Your father's farm, your old life?" Faye considered the question honestly. "I miss my father and I miss the familiarity of that life, but I don't regret leaving. Everything I have now, everything I am now, is better because I had the courage to take a risk on us." "Thank you," Garrett said softly, "for taking that risk, for believing in what we could be together." "Thank you for asking me to," Faye replied. "Thank you for seeing something in me worth believing in." The months passed in a rhythm of work and creativity, teaching and ranching, poetry and practical living. Faye continued to submit her work to various publications, and while she received plenty of rejections, she also began to place poems with increasing regularity. Her reputation as a poet slowly grew, and she started receiving letters from readers who had been moved by her work. In the summer of 1884, a year after Garrett had first ridden up to her Kansas farm, Faye discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with a complex mix of joy and anxiety. She wanted a family with Garrett, but she worried about how a child would affect her teaching and writing. When she told Garrett, his face lit up with such pure happiness that her anxieties faded. "We're going to have a baby," he said wonderingly. "We're going to be parents." "I'm scared," Faye admitted. "I don't know if I can be a good mother and still teach and write." "You can be whatever you want to be," Garrett said firmly. "We'll figure it out together just like we've figured out everything else. You don't have to give up your dreams to be a mother, Faye. We'll find a way to make it all work." And they did. When their son was born in February of 1885, they named him Henry after Faye's father. He was a healthy, loud baby who seemed to inherit his father's sturdy build and his mother's observant eyes. Faye took a few months off from teaching after Henry's birth, but she returned the following fall, bringing the baby with her to the schoolhouse where he would sleep in a cradle while she taught. Her students were enchanted by the baby, and the older girls fought over who got to help care for him during breaks. She also continued writing, though now she wrote during stolen moments, while Henry napped, late at night after everyone else was asleep, early in the morning before the house stirred. Her poetry changed again, incorporating her experiences of motherhood, the fierce love and occasional frustration of caring for a small person who was entirely dependent on her. When Henry was 2 years old, Faye gave birth to a daughter they named Caroline. 2 years after that, another son arrived whom they called Thomas. The house that had once been a bachelor establishment was now filled with the noise and chaos of children, and Faye sometimes marveled at how completely her life had transformed. Through it all, Garrett remained her steadfast partner and champion. He split child care duties equally, never suggesting that raising children was solely Faye's responsibility. He protected her writing time fiercely, taking the children on long walks or teaching them ranch skills so she could have quiet hours to work. "You're more than just a mother or a teacher or a rancher's wife," he reminded her whenever she felt overwhelmed. "You're a poet, Faye. That's not something you can or should set aside." By 1890, 7 years after their marriage, Faye had published enough poems that a small press in Chicago offered to collect them into a book. The day she held the first copy in her hands, seeing Poems of the Wind River Valley by Faye Cooper embossed on the cover, she wept. The book didn't become a bestseller, but it sold respectably and received positive reviews from several literary magazines. More importantly, it established Faye as a legitimate poet, not just a hobbyist or amateur. Readers wrote to tell her how her poems had moved them, how her observations of Western life had given voice to their own experiences. Garrett was impossibly proud, showing the book to everyone he encountered and reciting his favorite poems from memory. Graham, who had long since warmed completely to Faye, displayed a copy prominently in the ranch house living room. Gregory wrote a glowing review for the local newspaper, perhaps biased, but also genuinely appreciative of his sister-in-law's talent. By 1895, the Wind River Ranch had grown into one of the most successful operations in the region. Graham's management, combined with the hard work of all 3 brothers, had built something truly impressive. They had expanded to 300 acres, with a substantial cattle herd and a thriving horse breeding program that Faye managed. The original ranch house had been expanded to accommodate 2 growing families. Gregory had married a woman from Lander named Sarah, and they had twin boys who were close in age to Caroline. The house was perpetually noisy and chaotic, filled with children and animals and activity. Faye had published 2 more books of poetry and had become something of a local celebrity. She still taught at the school in Lander, now as headmistress, and had developed a reputation for inspiring students to love literature and think critically about the world. One evening in late spring, Faye and Garrett took a rare opportunity to ride up to their favorite spot overlooking the valley. The children were all occupied with Graham and Sarah, and they had a few hours to themselves. They sat on a sun-warmed rock, watching the light change on the mountains, comfortable in the silence that comes from years of companionship. "You remember," Faye said eventually, "that first evening when you asked me to read to you? When you said you wanted to hear me read every poem ever written?" "Of course I remember. It was the beginning of everything. You asked me to read to you forever. And I have, haven't I? Even with all the chaos and responsibilities and challenges, we've never stopped sharing poetry." "We haven't," Garrett agreed. "Every evening that we can, we read together. It's become the foundation of our life together, that ritual of sharing words and beauty." "I was thinking," Faye said, "about writing a poem about that first evening. About how a chance encounter between a farm girl reading to her cow and a cowboy with a thrown horseshoe became this whole life, this whole family." "I'd love to read that poem," Garrett said. "Though I think you should know that for me, it was never really chance. The moment I heard you reading Whitman, I was already lost. I knew I had found something precious that I couldn't let go of. Even though we just met. Especially because we just met and I could already see who you were. Brilliant, passionate, kind, unconventional. Everything I didn't know I was looking for." Faye leaned against him, watching their children's children playing in the valley below. Henry was teaching his younger siblings to ride, showing the patience and gentleness with animals that he'd inherited from his mother. Caroline was reading under a tree, already showing signs of her parents' literary inclinations. Thomas was helping Gregory with fence repairs, sturdy and practical like his Uncle Graham. "We built something good, didn't we?" Faye said softly. "Not just a family or a successful ranch, but a life that matters. A life where poetry and pragmatism both have their place." "We built something extraordinary," Garrett corrected. "And we're not done yet. There are more poems to write, more children to raise, more years to share. Read to me." Faye asked, handing him the book of her own poetry that she had brought along. So Garrett read her own words back to her, his voice giving them new life, new meaning. He read about the Kansas prairie and the Wyoming mountains, about love found in unexpected places, about the courage it takes to build a life on your own terms. When he finished, they sat together in the fading light, 2 people who had taken a chance on each other and built something that would outlast them both. Their children would carry forward the love of literature and beauty they had instilled. Their poetry would endure, speaking to future generations about what it meant to be fully alive. "Thank you," Faye said quietly, "for listening that first day, for asking me to read to you, for making me believe my words mattered." "Thank you," Garrett replied, "for saying yes. For taking a risk on a dusty cowboy with dreams of teaching, for sharing your gift with me and with the world." They rode back to the ranch as the stars emerged, their hands clasped, their hearts full. Behind them, the valley spread out in twilight beauty. Ahead, their home glowed with lamplight and echoed with laughter. It was a life built on poetry and partnership, on the courage to choose love over fear, connection over isolation. And every evening, for the rest of their long lives together, Garrett would ask Faye to read to him, and she would open a book and share the words that had brought them together and sustained them through everything that followed. It was their ritual, their anchor, their way of remembering that beauty and meaning exist in the world if you're brave enough to seek them out and share them with someone who truly understands. Their story became legend in the Wind River Valley, the tale of the poet and the cowboy who found each other against all odds and built a legacy of love and literature that enriched everyone around them. And when Faye finally published her autobiography years later, she began it with these words: "I was reading poetry to my cow when love found me, in the form of a cowboy who understood that words could matter as much as survival, and who asked me to read to him forever. This is the story of how I said yes, and how that yes changed everything."